Hi, I'm Nathaniel. Some of you might know me now from my last video talking about codes, legislation and standards and other things that apply to metal roofing. We spoke about what governs metal roofing. Well, so many of you responded really well to that video, so I've decided that I'll make some more. Today, the video that I'm making is looking at standards. Not a particular standard, but just standards as we use every day on the job site. Before I get started, as always, for those of you who haven't seen the last video, I just need to put out a quick disclaimer just to say that this is only my opinion. All the information I'm giving you in this video is general in nature. You should always seek independent legal advice before acting on anything that I'm saying in these videos, or independent advice in addition to your legal advice from an engineer or a suitably qualified person in the field that you need advice in. For those of you who didn't see the last video, I'm just a roofer like you guys. I still do roofing every day at the moment, plus I do some consultancy work as well. I have a background in roofing. It goes far back to the late 90s. 38 years old now, so sharing a little bit of this stuff just to help better educate others on job sites, specifically roofers, plumbers and chippies and others who might work in our industry and put roofs on. We'll cut straight to it now. We'll look at standards. So firstly, what is a standard? Well, if you go to the Australian Standards or standards.org.au, they outline there about how standards apply in general. Well, I specifically, as we discussed last video, we look at standards like AS 3500, specifically 0.3. We look at AS 1562. We look at, we're going to also today discuss about obsolete standards to or withdrawn standards that are no longer in use, like the HP 114 for box cutters and things like that. We're going to see how some of those things, even though they're withdrawn, they're still used and can be enforced in some states. And how each state looks at things a little different. So I've had inquiries from people in Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, by far the vast majority since last video. So first thing today we're going to look at is, in Australia, in law, there is a Latin maxim which applies. It says, ignorantia legis nomenum excusat. That really means ignorance of the law excuses no one. Or when on site and someone comes up and talks about compliance, whether you've done something to a standard or not, you can't say, oh, look, I didn't know that standard was there, or I didn't know that law existed. Because in Australia, that Latin maxim, which actually comes from the Bible of Leviticus 5 verse 17 originally, and it was brought into Australia's law that way. Ignorance of law is no excuse. It's not good enough to say, oh, I didn't know that law existed firstly, so that won't get you off the hook if you do a bad job. So now that we know where it came from, or that Latin maxim and the Bible quote that all law applies in Australia, how do standards become part of law? Well, that happens interestingly in an interesting way. I've provided you on a slide here, firstly, which you'll see in a second. In Queensland, we have the Building Act 1975. Which I'll put that picture up, you guys should be able to see right now. That refers to, in section 14, about the Building Code of Australia and other sections in the Building Act. In New South Wales, in their building regulations, Building Act as well, it's got a different name, New South Wales. I'll put that up there now for you guys to see. New South Wales, so I haven't quoted the right legislative name for it, but here it is. And also for you guys in Victoria, we have the Plumbing Regulations 2018, which also talk about more specifically the standards. So the regulation is still in Queensland and New South Wales. We have more of a Building Act. In Victoria, you guys work to, especially in roofing, you work to the regulation, the plumbing regulation there. So that's available for you to see on the screen now. So now you know a little bit about Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria, you can see where the standards are talked about in your legislation, which gives those standards some real, should I say, power, which they can be enforced definitely by either a court or an on-site inspector. In Queensland, we have the Queensland Building Construction Commission. New South Wales, I think it's Fair Trading. I might be wrong. I'm not sure in Victoria, Victorian Building Authority, I think they do compliance down there. I spoke with VBA before. But either of those, all those bodies from Queensland to Victoria have, since we're focusing on these states, have enforcement, building enforcement to different degrees, different powers within their states. So as you can see from what I've shown you, you now know that standards are in law and they're adopted in law. Also, I've attached some interesting things. When legislation refers to the building code, for example, so you can see in various states it talks about either the National Construction Code in New South Wales, they've called it, or the BCA in Queensland, they've called it here. And in Victoria, you have the plumbing legislation in there. It talks about the SAHB 39. Well, in the SAHB 39, it references the National Construction Code. So because Victoria has adopted that in their plumbing regulation, you're also bound by the National Construction Code. So I've attached a few pictures there to show in volume 2, part 3.5, particularly in the roofing section, how through the building, through legislation, how we're bound by law to adopt whatever's in the Building Code of Australia as well. So there's a couple of pictures up there for you guys to have a look at as well, which I've taken. So now you've seen those. The next step is that you now know how it's adopted into law, standards in general here. You need to understand the terminology. Now, on the screen, you'll see another picture very shortly about the wording in standards. So there are words that are in the standards that make them mandatory, and when they're used in law, mandatory. So as you'll see, the words must, shall, and there's another word which I've forgotten about, but must and shall are definitely two of the words in there, as you'll see on the screen now. They're straight from Standards Australia, and they describe how the words must and shall should be used when enforcing standards on a job site or with roofing specifically. So when you see the words something shall be done a certain way or something must be done a certain way, those words are very strong and you've got to really do them that way. There's no way around it. So if it went to court and that was referenced, like a consultant or another roofer or someone went to oppose you and was employed by either the regulator or by another private person, got an expert in, they would refer to things. If they're worth $1, they should know this, and they'll refer to the standards that say you must and shall. Don't confuse these two words with other words like recommended. So when you see the words recommended or may or those type of words, those are non-mandatory words. So mandatory words are shall, must, and there's another word that the standards talk about, shall and must. Then there's the other one, it is recommended. So recommended's a non-mandatory word. And once again, for all these things, check with a aptly qualified solicitor or legal practitioner to give you the right interpretation of these things, because they practice this stuff day in, day out. So with all that said now, we got standards that we got the standards that are in law. We know where that comes from. We got the wording in the standards now, shall, must, recommended. Those words, when you read a standard, you should look at the wording very carefully and see how it applies. So people can't say, oh, something must be done this way or something should be done this way. It's, very well explained in the Australian Standards website. The question is, in Australia, well, the next thing we're talking about in Australia, as we mentioned at the start, ignorance is no excuse for the law. So if someone comes to site, like a compliance officer in your state, whatever that might be, QBCC, VBA, or Fair Trading in New South Wales, comes to site, looks at your work and goes, or somebody else and goes, that doesn't comply. And you go, oh, but I didn't know about it. Clearly we know now that that's no excuse. So what what do we do after that? Well, if you didn't know, you didn't know. Well, they will say, well, you're supposed to have looked at the legislation or the standards say so. And you'll say, okay, well, fair enough. Yep, all right. I know a bit about the standards now. I've watched Nat's videos. I know what a standard is, you know. So what's the next stage? Well, the confusion I see when I started studying this type of thing a few years ago was that you've got to pay for standards. As you'll see on the screen, I'll just give you an example of AS3500, for example. It's up on screen there. AS3500, it's $200 for that. When you look at the Building Code of Australia, BCA, or you look at the Victorian plumbing regulations or the legislation that's in New South Wales, I think the Home Building Act, it might be called, and the Building Act 1975 Queensland, they're all freely available. You really have no excuse not to be able to access those. The problem is, and this is the confusion I see, and legal practitioners come across this a lot, proper lawyers, is what about apprentices that are on like $300 or $500 a week, and you got a set of standards there that cost $200? Is it reasonable that someone should understand a law, now especially a standard that is adopted into law, if they've got to pay that much money for a standard, when all the other laws are basically free or freely available? And that is the case. You can almost get any law for free in Australia. I'm not sure, and you need to check with a lawyer about this, but there might actually be some authority in each state or Commonwealth that actually say law is freely available. When law references a standard, I'm confused as to why standards still cost money, but yet you're supposed to understand it. That's a legal question that more of you guys need to put to those in authority and ask why we need to pay for those standards. If they quote them, my view is they should be for free, because I don't know how apprentices and regular people that aren't like me, don't have a lot of money, like I've forked out thousands of dollars just for a few standards. So it's a good question for you guys to consider. The last point of this video is there are obsolete or withdrawn standards. So the standards that are withdrawn, HB 114 is a big one. I had a guy one time on a social media platform say to me, I prefer the HB 114. I was like, what's the HB 114? Didn't know what that was in Queensland. I tried finding it in the Building Code of Australia. I couldn't find it. And National Construction Code, I found it in the Victorian Plumbing Regulation 2018. It references it. Now, if you go to Standards Australia, you'll see it's a withdrawn standard. Standards Australia do say that you can use a withdrawn standard if it's mentioned in legislation, which it is mentioned in legislation in Victoria. So guys, when you're quoting or when you're going into a dispute, or when you're reasoning with the owner to get paid, if they know what they're talking about, an engineer or someone specifically, be very, very careful. Always get help when quoting withdrawn standard, particularly as the gentleman did with the HB 114. He can use it because in Victoria it says you can, but be mindful of that when doing it in other states or in any place that might have those withdrawn standards. So that's my video today, looking at standards. If you've got any other questions, please put them in the comment section. Even on Facebook, you can ask me a question through Messenger. Like the videos. If you like them, I'll keep making them. Got huge feedback from the last one that most people really appreciate it. So I'll look at the next, make a next video for you guys, and maybe do some interviews down the track with different roofers and get their feedback.